Welcome to our session. Welcome to our session tonight. I'm going to be sharing a little bit of an introduction to the Old Testament. And I find that most people really don't know their way around the Old Testament at all. And it's kind of scary and it's long. And there's a lot of books that are in the Old Testament. They're very difficult to read. We've probably read Genesis, we've probably read some Psalms, maybe some Proverbs, but that's about as far as we've gotten in our exploration of the Old Testament. And so I thought I'd spend tonight just to give you a little bit of an overview of the Old Testament, make you feel a little bit more, what is this all about and why should we care? So the end of the hour is really about why should we care? So let's start going through this. So what I wanted to show you is actually taken out of a book called The Epic of Eden by a professor by the name of Sandra Richter. And it's something that I studied while I was in seminary myself. And it's a really nice depiction of the redemptive history. So what does redemptive history mean? It means, if you take a look at this picture, in the pages of the Bible, the story is told of the beginning of mankind in the Garden of Eden, where God had created Adam and Eve, where Eve listened to the serpent, ate of the fruit, offered some to Adam, and the result was that they were asked by God to leave the garden. And with it came physical and spiritual death. And so Eden was like a big drop, as we can see here. But we serve a very good God and a very loving God, and he wanted to bring mankind back to him. And so we see in the pages of first the Old Testament, then of course the New Testament, that there were a number of so-called covenants that God made with man. And it starts with Noah and the building of the ark. It goes on to Abraham being promised that he would be the descendant of a great nation, and out of him come the 12 patriarchs, and from there on the great nation of Israel arises. Then we have the Israelites captives in Egypt for many, many years. And coming out of that, the Mosaic covenant is formed, where God speaks to Moses and tells Moses, you will lead my people out of Egypt, and here are the things that I will do. And they find their way out of Egypt back into the promised land. And this is where we then find many, many years later, around the year 1000 before Christ, we find King David. And there's another covenant that's made between God and King David, again promising him that there's a lineage that will continue and that will ultimately result in the coming of a Messiah that will save the people, and that there would be a new covenant made that would be a different type of covenant. And this is, of course, what we see fulfilled in Jesus. And when you see, so that's the New Testament. If you see the line that goes up, squiggly line goes up to New Jerusalem, this is basically the closing of this redemptive arc where we go from the fall in Eden. And then if you read all the way through to the book of Revelation, there is a New Jerusalem depicted. So God is preparing a place for his people to come join him once again, made possible through this new covenant that Jesus brought with him. So that's just a very quick overview of the redemptive history that we see from the beginning of the Bible in the book of Genesis all the way to the book of Revelation, where we read about the New Jerusalem. So talking a little bit more about the Old Testament, you see books listed here. Now, I should say one thing. The books that are in the Old Testament that you see listed here are the ones that are agreed upon by all traditions, pretty much, as root books, shall we say. Now, we, in our tradition, in the Peshitta, in our Syriac Bible, we have additional books. They're called deuterocanonical books in the Orthodox world. They're called by a different name in the Protestant world, which is a little bit more derogatory, but not really a bad thing. It's just that we prefer to call them deuterocanonical books. So we have anywhere between 17 to 20 additional books. They're brief books usually but they are part of our canon. They were accepted by the Jewish community before Christ, but then kind of fell out of favor. We've carried them forward, and some of the other Orthodox traditions have even different books. So, for example, the Ethiopian Church has the books of First and Second Enoch, which nobody else in the world has. So just to give you a little bit of a heads up, there is a little bit of fluctuation in terms of the number of books, but the ones that you see here are the ones that even a Catholic or a Protestant could agree. We all can agree on these. So these are the core books of the Old Testament. And of course, we start in Genesis. If you go on the left side, you will see the names of the books. And you kind of see when is this happening? What is the story there? And you see that this goes all the way from creation, or what is called in a more theological term, the antediluvian period or pre-flood period. Then we see the flood. So this is Noah and the ark. So that's post-diluvian or after the flood. We then see the call of Abraham, so the patriarchal period. And you can see that this is probably about the 21st century BC. So just to put that in a historical context. And then the move to Egypt and the Egyptian sojourn and bondage is about 19th century BC. So these are all the things that are described in the book of Genesis, the very first book of the Bible. It's a great read. If you haven't read it yet, I recommend you can start there. Then, of course, there's the rest of the what are called Torah in the Jewish community. So it's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, or the 5 books of Moses, which are the first 5 books of our Old Testament. And there it talks about the Israelites coming out of Egypt. You may remember the 10 plagues. So that was the starting point for them to leave Egypt. They had wilderness wanderings of 40 years. And this is about 15th century BC. So they spent 400 years in Egypt before God broke them free out of Egypt. They crossed the Red Sea at that point in time, but then wandered in the desert for 40 years. So ultimately, that generation had completely died out. So everybody, including Moses, was gone, with the exception of 2 men, Joshua and Caleb, and they were the ones that were allowed to go into the promised land. And so they were the ones that actually conquered Canaan, as it's called in the Bible. Modern day Israel is probably what we could think of, the Palestinian areas and so on. That's what we're talking about. So this is about 15th century before Christ. We then go into a number of more historical books. Judges is a really, really difficult book because it talks about the Israelites basically falling away from the Lord time and time and time again, and God sends them in his great mercy. He sends them judges to rule over them. So there were no kings at that time. And this is about the 14th century BC, but it ends in a horrific episode where actually a man winds up killing his prostitute and parting her into all sorts of parts and shipping them out to the different tribes to say how deeply they had fallen, basically. So God does not give up on his people, thank God. And so we will now see more historical books. So for example, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Kings, 2nd Chronicles. Now these books tend to go by different names depending which Bible you read. So if you read the Peshitta, it might be called, for example, you might have, or let me take it back, maybe not the Peshitta as an example, but the Septuagint might have 1st through 4th Kings rather than 1st and 2nd Samuel and so on. So there's differences in how these books are named, but that's just a nomenclature question. But it tells us the story of the Israelites through their continuing walking away from the Lord, continuously sinning, continuously running after other lords, basically. They wind up anointing first King Saul around the year 1000 BC. And King Saul is then followed by King David, who's, of course, known to just about everybody, the man after God's own heart. And what we do see there, though, is that the kingdom of Israel is actually, out of a united state at first, becomes a divided kingdom. And then one after another, the chips fall. So first, Babylon invades, the Babylonian Empire invades, and we see, I'm sorry, that's actually backwards what I'm saying right now, but they're being conquered by the Assyrian Empire in 722 BC, and then in 586 BC, they're overrun by Babylon. And so these books describe this. They describe the exile. So this is where we get some of the writings like Ezekiel and Daniel. And if you've ever taken a look at them, they're very adventurous books. And then Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, they're post-exilic, and they show how the people of Israel came back into the land and then what they did to try to reestablish their relationship with God. So basically the time frame of the whole Pentateuch. So Pentateuch is basically another technical or theological word for the first 5 books of the Bible. And so what we see here is that the time period here, there is a 350-year gap between Genesis 12 through 50, which is considered the patriarchal period. Now, we don't know the timing of Genesis 1 through 11, because that's where the earth is created, the primeval period. But then all the way through Deuteronomy, the end of Deuteronomy, we see the formation of the nation of Israel under Moses, and that takes us all the way up to the year 1400 BC. So that's the first 5 books of the Bible are that time frame. So just to understand and give you a little bit of a picture. This is a great depiction, and you can take a look at that at your leisure. It kind of gives you a little bit of all of this in a more graphical version. It tells you about the Assyrian destruction by Shalmaneser V. It tells you in the year 722 BC, then in the year 586 or 87, they're overrun by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. So these are the things that happened to Israel, but it was really something that turned them back around to the Lord ultimately. So they rebuilt the temple. You can see that at the bottom of the screen. And so we're finding ourselves at the end of the Old Testament. We're actually finding ourselves about 400 years before the arrival of Jesus Christ. And so there is a 400-year gap between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and that's also something to understand. Just a very quick glance at what this world looked like. So you can see Babylon over to the east. Elam is another empire, the Assyrian Empire to the north of Babylon. You see Nineveh. You see Egypt, of course, to the west. And so that's what their world pretty much looked like during that time of Abram's travels into Canaan, what would then become later on modern-day Israel, modern-day the Palestinian territories. Middle East today looks different, but I think we all can kind of, if I flip back and forth, we can kind of put our heads on where we're talking about, where all this is happening. And so moving on, let's take a quick look at these covenants that God made. One of them was, as I mentioned already, with Noah and the Ark of Noah. We've heard that story, probably all of us. So this is where God blesses Noah, tells him to be fruitful and multiply, and he repeats to Noah what is given to Adam before the fall. So here's the promise that he will continue to bless the people. Now, again, as I said throughout this, there's many disruptions, many times that the people that should be of God are actually not of God. They walk away from him. And so we find ourselves now with another covenant, the Abrahamic covenant. Abraham, of course, as the father of all the Israelite nations. So he's promised a great nation. And you may remember that he and Sarah were unable to have children at first. And so he has a child with Sarah's handmaid. And then later on, 13 years later, actually, his son is born, Isaac is born. And so this is actually the beginning of this blessing to all peoples. And the blessing comes through the line of Isaac. But God also blesses the first child that was born. And so that's also something important to understand, that he actually blesses what I would consider the ancestor of the Arab peoples. And an interesting story. So again, reading it makes a lot of sense once you read through these books. Moving on, we're now coming, we're in Egypt, now we're coming out of Egypt through Moses. So the Mosaic covenant deals with how to live as God's chosen people. And what God tells Moses and through him to the people of Israel is, if you obey, I will bless you. The flip side of that is, if you disobey, there will be significant consequences. If you want to read that particular chapter, I highly recommend it. It's Deuteronomy chapter 28. It's fascinating to read how God says how much he will bless the people if they follow him, but how much they can expect to hurt if they do not. And that's not because he's mean or evil, but that's just because his blessing won't be on them at that point in time. So then moving forward again, we're going through the beginning of the kingship in Israel. So first King Saul, now King David. And here God makes another covenant with King David. And he says that David's sons will be ruling for all time. And again, that his sons will be blessed if they obey, punished if they disobey. The interesting part is David's sons actually caused the breakup of his kingdom after his death. But who is in the Davidic line is our Lord Jesus Christ. So if we read the genealogies in the New Testament, we will see that there's a direct connection made back to King David. So ultimately, in extension, his son will be ruling forever. And of course, when I say that, I'm talking about Jesus Christ in the sense of sonship in terms of lineage. So finally, then the new covenant through Jesus, it erases these past failures and it gives us the power to obey in the promise, and he promises to bless us. So what Jesus did for us is that he died so that death would be defeated. He died so that our sinful nature that we've inherited from Adam and Eve's fall, that we're able to lay that aside and that we're able to actually become holy as he is holy, I like to say, so that it gives us that new nature where we can actually learn about him, where we can follow him, where we can obey him, and he will bless us abundantly. So these are the covenants that we see there, and this new covenant is already hinted at in the Old Testament in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 31. So you may want to take a look at that. Now, what happened during the time of Moses? Moses was given 10 commandments. And so what do they deal with and what happened? So commandments 1 and 2 dealt with the fact that the Israelites were not to have any other gods or idols. And when I say Israelites, think about that in extension also for us, right? Because these commandments are repeated in the New Testament by and large. So we should not neglect them. So what happened though in Exodus 32? We see the violation of this particular command, of these commandments. What the people of Israel do when Moses is up on the mountain to receive the tablets with the 10 commandments from God, they become impatient. They go talk to his brother Aaron and ask Aaron to help them. So he basically has them give them all their gold. And in turn, he molds for them a golden calf that they then begin to worship. And needless to say, when Moses comes from the mountain, he is very, very upset with them. That's another story, too long to tell now. But I just wanted to point out this commandment 1 and 2. First time it was broken was when the people of Israel decided that they wanted to worship a different God than Yahweh, their God. Commandment 3, do not take the name of the Lord in vain. Again, we see an example here. The first violation already happens in the book of Leviticus, which is one of the first 5 books of the Bible, where a curse is expressed in a fight. So you can look that up in your leisure time. The commandment number 4, keeping the Sabbath day holy. Violation first time around, again, in the first 5 books of the Bible, the man who gathers wood on the Sabbath. So he broke that. Now, if you may remember from the last 2 sessions we had, Jesus actually declared himself the Lord of the Sabbath. And so this is actually the one commandment that's not repeated in the New Testament. So just as a little side note. So again, I refer you back to our prior sessions that we've done. Commandment number 5, honor your parents. Here we see that there's a violation in Deuteronomy, which is, again, one of the first 5 books of the Bible, where we see that there is an instruction to on what to do with a rebellious son. So we're already seeing that the Israelites had children that were breaking the commandment to honor their parents. Do not commit murder. On it goes. Now we're actually leaving the first 5 books of the Bible, but this is right after the Israelites came into Canaan. And we see, that's what I was referring to earlier, the murder of the concubine of this Levite that had a concubine, and she wound up being horribly abused by a number of men. And in turn, what this Levite does is he parts her into many pieces, the body of this woman, and then sends it out to the tribes of Israel to lament what has happened here, that this woman was killed and how far away from God they are. And this is the note that the book of Judges ends on. Commandment number 7, do not commit adultery. Well, I'm almost certain most of us have heard of this violation when David saw Bathsheba bathing on the rooftop, and King David decided that he wanted to have another man's wife, ending up in the death of her husband, commanded by King David, and Bathsheba actually losing the first child that she has with David. Do not steal, commandment number 8. Here we have a great example in the book of Judges again, where Achan steals from God at Jericho. So they were given certain rules when they conquered the city of Jericho. And Achan was one of the Israelite tribe leaders, and he violated these rules of holy war as had been given by God when they were to conquer Canaan. And so we see this violation of do not steal straight there in the book of Judges 6 and 7. Now, to cut to the chase, Achan wound up dying a pretty horrible death because he had stolen and not listened to what God had commanded. Commandments 9 and 10, do not bear false witness, do not covet. So here we have the example of Ahab, an Israelite king that actually covets the vineyard of one of his neighbors named Naboth, and then uses that false testimony to have Naboth killed. And we find that story in 1 Kings 19 through 21. Again, the numbering may be off if you're reading it in the Septuagint or in the Peshitta. But this is another story where we see that by lying and by cheating, he seeks to gain this vineyard of his neighbor, and in turn, he has Naboth killed, and in turn, he suffers Ahab suffers horrible consequences, and actually his wife Abigail becomes one of the wives of King David. So here's Israel under Saul, David, and Solomon. So you can see Syria pretty prominently there in the middle of the map. We see Moab and Edom and Ammon. Those are names that you hear in the Old Testament a lot. Amalek and Philistia on the coastline there. Also, these are names that are very prominent throughout the Old Testament. This is then the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. So this is before they ran into problems. This is the United Kingdom. It was good-sized kingdom. So you can see that they were around the Sea of Galilee in the north there. You see the lake, and then down to the south, you see the Dead Sea. So they were spread out across modern-day Israel, modern-day Syria, modern-day Jordan, modern-day Lebanon. So this was the actual kingdom of Israel and Judah at that time. Here's another look that is important for our understanding of the Old Testament, the Assyrian and the Babylonian empires. So again, Assyria is the first nation or the first empire that overruns the kingdom of Judah and of Israel. So they take captive the 10 northern tribes, and then this was in losing it here, 722 BC. And then in 586 BC, so several hundred years later, or not even several hundred, Babylon is the reigning empire, and they overrun Judah, which is the southern portion of the formerly United Kingdom. And so then Judah and Benjamin are overrun at that point in time. Now, this is a look at the Persian and Greek empires. Now, they started rising later. This is as this evolves, we see how they spread out. I mean, it's huge empire. You can see that. And this is where we find ourselves now as we're heading towards the New Testament. So this is prior to the New Testament, but you can see these empires are shifting and changing. And a lot of the prophetic statements, for example, from the book of Daniel, when you look at these maps, it's starting to make sense what was said there. So this, just to summarize, that is kind of what we had looked at now. We talked about these covenants leading us from the fall in Eden all the way up to the New Jerusalem, which is the promise of God for us. And here's a look at the people of the redemptive history. So we see that Eden was intended for all people, but then there's this disruption happening when Adam and Eve sin. And out of this, we see this, that there's Noah, who is one man, and then there is Abraham, one family, because he's the patriarch of the 12 tribes. Then we see Israel in Egypt with Moses leading them out of Egypt and becoming one nation. And then later we see the church, so the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, that is intended for all people, once again. So again, we see this redemptive arc from the Eden that was supposed to be for all people, now to the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church that is again intended for all people. Yeah, this is just another quick look about how these names fall on a timeline. So from Adam to Noah to Abraham to Moses with King David, ultimately in that lineage with the covenant, Jesus, and then back to the New Jerusalem. So there are examples, and we will probably not have the time now to take a look at all of them. But for example, we have Psalm 22. And Psalm 22 is one of the Messianic Psalms, as it's called. Now, Psalm 22 was written, of course, a long, long time ago. So King David, actually, a lot of the Psalms are attributed to King David, and this in particular is one of them. And I wanted to read just a little bit of it to you. So this is Psalm 22, starting in verse 1. And maybe this sounds familiar. My God, why have you forsaken me? Now, anybody want to venture a guess who uttered that? Yes, Jesus on the cross. So many of us think, well, why is he saying that? Has God forsaken him? But if you read the rest of the psalm, it is actually what's called a messianic psalm. So in other words, Jesus really is declaring here, even on the cross, that he is the promised Messiah. So, for example, there's in this psalm, I've skipped down to verse 12. Many bulls encircle me, strong bulls of Bashan surround me. They open wide their mouths at me, like a ravening and roaring lion. I'm poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax, it is melted within my breast. My mouth is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to my jaws. You lay me in the dust of death. For dogs are all around me, a company of evildoers encircles me. They bound my hands and feet. I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. Listen to this one. They divide my clothes among themselves, and for my clothing they cast lots. Now again, what happened at the crucifixion? The Roman soldiers gambled for the outer garment of Jesus. They cast lots for it. So you can see that these prophetic statements here in the Psalm 22 are something that actually point the people towards Christ. Another example, a very well-known example that we probably hear the most around Christmas time, the Nativity, is Isaiah 7:14. And so Isaiah 7:14 says, "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Look, the young woman," and some translations have virgin here, "is with child and shall bear a son and shall name him Emmanuel." And Emmanuel simply means God is with us. So again,